Yeah, it's funny, so living in our neighborhood all these years. And we know our neighbors across the street, we know our neighbors on either side of the house, and maybe one house down across the street. And after that, really yeah, we don't know about that. Hi there, how are you? Good.
Thank you. We had 7 million people last time, so it's Friday.
Deal or no deal? Yeah.
We'll negotiate.
Yeah, expectations.
Are we else? Yeah, I just love you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to lecture 4 in our series about American church politics. Today, as I mentioned last week, today is kind of the second of the two-part from last week. We looked at Jews as progressives. This week, we're going to look at Jews in America further to the left. That's why I call this evening Immigrants, Jewish Immigrants and the Romance of the Left. Really, we're going to focus on American Jews as socialists. We're also going to look at 2 moments that grew out of this association with the left, combining what we talked about last week and this week, to also talk about the New Deal and how this was affected by McCarthyism. So we're going to cover some ground this evening. We have a number of things to talk about, but where we're going to start is the same way we started every week. We've got to define some terms. We are going to be using some terms, some political terms. We've got to make sure that they're clear. Now, the main political terms we're going to be using, one is socialism, which as political terms go these days is misused and misunderstood and just beaten into a bloody pulp repeatedly. So I'll define that for you in a moment. And there are also the terms, 3 related terms: communism, Marxism, Bolshevism. 3 terms which are also pretty misunderstood. The biggest mistake that people make who don't properly understand these terms is assuming somehow that communism and socialism are the same thing. They are not. So let me start there. Socialism is an economic term. Socialism is an economic term which means public control of the means of society. In other words, socialism really is a response to capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system where you have private control of the means of production, private ownership, private property. Socialism means no, you don't have private control, you have public control. Now, public control doesn't necessarily mean state control. It simply means people together. So it's an economic system. Communism, on the other hand, is a political system. It refers to a particular form of government. So where socialism deals with economic organization, communism, see that Marxism and Bolshevism are variants on that. Communism doesn't talk about economic organization per se. It talks about the distribution of power and authority. Now, is it significant? Is this just splitting semantic hairs to distinguish one as economic and the other as political? No, and here's why. A socialist economic system can exist and has existed within different political systems. So, most communist systems, most communist states will employ a kind of socialist economic organization, but not always. The biggest exception to that rule, of course, is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, when we speak about the Soviet Union, that's where we most often conflate the terms communist and socialist. While there are times when the Soviet Union was socialist, there also were times when there wasn't public control of the economy, it was state control of the economy. It wasn't all people or all citizens controlling the economy together. It was a small oligarchy perched on top of a communist system. Okay. So that difference is important. Yeah, I should also add that a socialist economic organization has also existed within non-communist states. For example, Sweden is a social democracy. Sweden is a place where much of the economy is controlled collectively, presided over by one government organization or another, but it's controlled collectively, but there still is individual ownership. There still is individual property. The notion of individual rights is still there. Sweden is socialist, but not communist. Now, what about these other terms? Marxist, Bolshevik. Well, Marxism and communism are often interchangeable because it was Karl Marx who really coined the term. Now, what Marx had in mind in his Communist Manifesto is he wanted to do away with the emphasis on the freedom of the individual, although he did believe that every individual was entitled to civil rights and all members of society were entitled to the same rights. But Marx's main critique, particularly of Western democracies, was what he noted was, his critique was that even though everyone ideally would have the same rights, there was an unequal participation in government. Power was not, and authority and influence were not distributed equally. This is something we noted that was inherent in 19th century liberalism, where if you were educated and property, you had greater influence over government, over policy. In many places, voting, participating in the political process, voting and holding office was contingent on some level of education and some level of property. And what Marx replaced that with, all of this is apart from economic organization, is that every single individual would have equal say in government. That the people, government, would be drawn from ordinary people. That was a brand new idea. So Marxism and communism originally were the same thing, but eventually there were examples of communist communities and communist organizations which were not Marxist by nature. Now, Marx had he defined communism or a communist society or state in a very particular way, but he also envisioned a very specific series of steps to get there. The most significant of which, I believe 3rd out of 5, was what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx said that in the transition from a liberal society to a communist society, ordinary working class, ordinary people, there would be a point where in order to establish this new almost utopian society, they would have to suspend the rights of others. That's what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. There would be a transition period between liberalism and communism, which wouldn't be communist at all, but actually would be totalitarian. A necessary transition. Now, Marx envisioned this as a transitional stage, but in some instances, the path to communism, in some states, the path to communism got stuck there, like the Soviet Union. They got to stage 3 or level 3 on the way to communism, and it just never went any further. Now, the reasons it didn't go further is a big separate story. We can probably pin 80% of that blame on Stalin, because Stalin, it turns out, wasn't really interested in any of this. because, Stalin. So the Soviet Union is an example of a country that was projecting itself as communist, and till its very demise in 1990 claimed to be communist. But in fact, after maybe 1919 or 1920, once Lenin died and was replaced by Stalin, it wasn't communist, because it really became a totalitarian state. And that's been one of the big confusing things, especially for Westerners, and I would say especially for Americans. The Soviet Union was, because it was a totalitarian state using the rhetoric of communism. And Soviet communism is often cited as, this is an example where the politics of the left become tyrannical, because it wasn't the politics of the left, it was only the rhetoric of the left. The politics were totalitarian, which is not left-wing at all. Okay? But there were examples, and this is really where you see the difference between communism and Marxism. There were examples, especially on smaller scale, where communities, they really did embrace Marx's full path to communism. The example we know the best is the kibbutz. The kibbutz, as a micro-society, was founded on the principle of Marx's communism and on the economic organization known as socialism. But the kibbutz, as a movement, didn't get stuck in the dictatorship of the proletariat, the kibbutzim, until, well, relatively recently. For a variety of reasons, there's been a bit of a decline in that society. But while the kibbutz system was working, these really were communist societies in the sense that every single member of the kibbutz, at least theoretically, and often in reality as well, were treated and had the same status as everyone else. It was never perfect. In fact, there's an interesting collection of memoirs known as the Plowwomen. Plowwomen. These are women who lived on the kibbutz, who said they always talked about egalitarian and everyone being equal, but men and women were never treated the same. But beyond that one important caveat, the kibbutz as a micro-society is probably the closest that communism ever working in the way that Marx envisioned it. And here also the difference between Bolshevism and communism and Marxism. Bolshevism is the particular brand or the particular trajectory of communism as it unfolded in the Soviet Union. Like the Russian word Bolshevik simply means majority. And within the Russian or the Soviet Communist Party, Lenin's Bolsheviks, they were one segment, and their brand of communism went out, then they got frozen in the dictatorship of the proletariat. What I would emphasize is, when we speak this evening of socialism and communism, we are not going to use that term interchangeably, because especially in the United States, these two things meant something very, very different. And the biggest difference is the fact that socialism as a form of economic organization was far more malleable and less radical than communism. Socialism, the ideas and the aims of the American Socialist Party, there was overlap between that and the aims, for example, of progressives. It doesn't mean progressives were socialist. It simply means some of the aims were the same. And where the overlap is in terms of economic organization. Just to give one specific example to make sure that it's clear. In a capitalist society, health insurance will only be available to individuals who can afford to buy it. That's capitalism. In a socialist society, where you have public control of the means of production, in this case, production refers to producing the service known as health insurance, society as a whole will make the conscious decision to provide health insurance for everyone. So yes, universal health care is a socialist idea, but it doesn't mean that espousing universal health care makes you a socialist. It's just one area where socialists and progressives happen to overlap. Okay? Now I'm asking you to think in a way, to see a fine line here, but it's an important one. I'm I'm asking you to engage a level of nuance, which especially these days, we are not used to using. The nuance part of our brain has been put to sleep for the last couple of years, but it's important. Got to wake it up, be able to follow what I'm talking about, okay? Just to be able to see that there are different versions of socialism. Okay. Now, so far in the series, one of the things we've noted generally about Jewish political behavior is that when it comes to choosing between radical and moderate forms of politics, whether on the right or the center or the left, Jews have tended toward the more moderate versions. Now, interestingly enough, we are going to speak about the most radical American politics of the 20th century, but even in the framework of these most radical politics, Jews who embraced these ideas, Jews who embraced communism, and Jews who embraced the economic organization known as socialism, tended to opt for the more moderate varieties. I'm using the word moderate relatively here, because even the most moderate form of socialism or communism is not as moderate as, let's say, liberalism or whatever, but it's more moderate than others. Let me make that clear. Within the socialist movement in Europe, there was a brand of socialism that was called Bernsteinism. Now, I'm guessing that no one here has ever heard of Bernsteinism. It has nothing to do with Leonard Bernstein. It would be way more interesting if it was something about music, although Bernstein himself was a bit of a Bernsteinist. But Bernsteinism was actually named after a socialist leader in Germany whose name was Edward Bernstein. And the socialism he embraced and the future he envisioned, that socialist future that he wanted to create in Europe, in his mind, the way to get there was not through social revolution. He didn't want mass upheaval. He didn't want a big revolution. He believed that the best way to transform a capitalist society into a socialist society was to work within the existing state and system, and for socialists to win concessions, to make changes from within. So what a Bernstein socialist wanted more than anything else as the mechanism of making change, let's say to improve the condition of the working class, was the creation of labor unions. So when we say trade unionism, that version of socialism, that's Bernsteinism. And you'll agree that is a much more moderate version of socialist change than a socialist who wants the change to come about through violent revolution. The overwhelming majority of Jewish socialism embraced it in its Bernsteinist form. Isn't it funny? You probably never heard of Bernsteinism, but as soon as I said trade unionism, that suddenly rang a bell. We know that Jews were involved in the trade union movement, but these were Jews who embraced a more moderate version of socialism, Bernsteinism. Most socialist Jews tended to be Bernsteinist Jews. Now let me make one more preliminary point, and then we can dive in more specifically. And that point is this: we have to set aside. Have to set aside. A couple of stereotypes. Well, we have to differentiate between two things, because the simple fact is, in America, whether you're talking about the socialist movement or the Communist Party, Socialist Party, Jews were disproportionately represented among the ranks of these movements. In other words, the percentage of Jews, or the percentage of socialists who were Jews, and the percentage of communists who were Jews in America was far greater than the overall percentage of Jews in the population. The percentage of Jews in the socialist movement was probably at its peak, probably 30 or 40%. 30 or 40% of socialists in America were Jews. And probably around the same for communists. That's on the one hand, okay? Now, that gave rise to a stereotype that to be a Jew and to be a communist is the same thing. all communists are Jews, all Jews are communists. Here's the problem with that crass stereotype. Even though a disproportionate number of communists and socialists were Jews, a very small percentage of Jews were socialists and communists. These were very small movements compared to other political movements, other movements of economic reform. Most Jews were not. Most Jews in America were either liberal or progressive. In fact, particularly the more radical versions of communism and socialism, which advocated revolution, Jews were overwhelmingly against that brand of communism and socialism. One of the things that Jews have had in common, both in America and Europe, is a certain wariness or a certain reluctance to foment instability. The last thing Jews want is violent revolution, because the notion was, even if the initial target of that revolution is not Jews, it's possible the instability and the violence could eventually spread and Jews could be targeted. We as Jews have always preferred stability over everything. Incremental, gradual change. Now, we disagree as to the pace of change, but we tend to be wary. Jews tend to be wary about revolutions, about social revolutions, any kind of revolution that's advocating violent upheaval. So most Jews in America were not socialists, they were not communists, but a very large, a disproportionately large percentage of communists and socialists were Jews. And you have to, it's another distinction you have to be able to see. But there was the image that the two were the same. And that image that all communists were Jews or all socialists were Jews was furthered by the fact that the three most prominent communist revolutions in Europe at the conclusion of the First World War, one was in 1917 in Russia, 1918 in Germany, 1919 in Hungary, amongst the leaders of these three revolutions were prominent Jews. A prominent Jew. They figured among the leaders. So Trotsky in Russia, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Béla Kun in Hungary. So it gave the impression that these revolutions were basically being led by Jews. Now, first of all, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Béla Kun had virtually nothing in the way of Jewish identity or connection to the Jewish community. The fact that they were Jewish to all three of them was incidental. Rosa Luxemburg, she wrote an essay where she says, I paraphrase, "My heart bleeds much more for struggling workers around the world." I think she said the peasants of Putumayo way more than it does for Jews. And that was true of all three of them. So there's an image, there's the reality. But the reality is also complicated because even though most Jews were anti-communist, anti-socialist, there still were the percentage of socialists and communists who were Jews was disproportionately high with respect to the overall population. That's clear. Now, the beginnings, the question, of course, we have to ask is why, among the ranks of communists and socialists, why was there a disproportionate number of Jews in these American movements? And the answer to that question begins not here, but actually begins in Europe. As all the political movements we've seen so far in this series, whether we're talking about the abolition movement or liberalism or progressivism, so too with socialism and communism, there are European roots. Now we're going to see a particularly American brand, American brands, but it really begins in Europe. So in this case, there are really two kinds of Jews in Europe who are drawn into the world of socialism and then into the world of communism. One group comes predominantly from Central Europe. One group came predominantly from Eastern Europe. Locally, we would say from the shtetl. So let's do Central Europe first. Most Central European Jews who became socialists or became communists were not themselves working class Jews. There was very little in the way of working class Jews in Central Europe. by the mid-19th century because the economic trajectory of Central European Jews went mostly in another direction. Look at in your typical Central European Jewish family. By Central Europe, I mean Germany or Hungary or the Habsburg monarchy, most of it, or even France, much of Europe, in fact. The trajectory would be you'd have one generation where the head of household, the occupation was peddler, and the next generation would be shopkeeper, and then the shopkeeper would make enough to send the kids, or at least the boys, to college, where being a shopkeeper wasn't good enough. You had to be a doctor or a lawyer, becoming professional. Now, in Europe, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and so forth, typically they were defined as a group of individuals known as the free professions, but they were also part of another group within European society known as the intelligentsia. Now, intelligentsia is a great word. It has nothing to do with intelligence. Intelligentsia is what we would call the intellectual class, intellectuals. So intellectuals were not only the most educated people. It wasn't simply a question of how smart you were. In fact, to be honest, I've known a lot of intellectuals who really weren't that smart, but only think they are. No reason to name names there. But to be part of the intelligentsia, it wasn't just how much you knew, it's that you spent your time reading, thinking, but also being critical of the problems of society around you. The intelligentsia was consistently at the forefront of social and political critique. In fact, they were seen in Europe especially, that was their job, to make sure that if there were problems, that the elites of society, whether government elites or commercial elites or even intellectual elites, didn't become complacent. Their job was to make sure problems were identified and they were addressed and changes took place. Now, within the ranks of the intelligentsia, European intelligentsia, especially in Central Europe, there was a disproportionate number of Jews for the reason that the intelligentsia was not drawn evenly from the population, but it wasn't drawn evenly from the population, but the intelligentsia tended to be drawn from the urban, educated population. And by the end of the 19th century, European Jewry was becoming more urban and more educated. In terms of levels of education, European Jews were far ahead of everyone else. Far ahead of everyone else. So your typical Central European Jew, some of whom, not all, but some of whom these European Jewish intellectuals, which included doctors and lawyers, who embraced socialism or communism, they embraced it as part of the intellectual leadership of one of these movements. They weren't working class people. They weren't factory workers looking for a better life. They were acting on behalf, they were trying to organize downtrodden workers. Now, in Eastern Europe, we have a different situation, particularly in Russia. There are some examples of Eastern European Jews becoming part of the Russian intelligentsia and embracing these movements that way. But in Eastern Europe, as opposed to Central Europe, we have the emergence of a Jewish working class. One of the reasons is that, long story short, it's west of Russia, prior to emancipation, being an artisan, craftsman, was not an option for most Jews. In most European states, you didn't find Jews who were artisans, who were tailors or table makers or whatever else artisans do. But in Eastern Europe, and this is something that goes all the way back to Poland, to medieval Poland, there were Jewish artisan guilds. And so the most common example is in Eastern Europe, there were a lot of Jewish tailors and seamstresses. Now, as Russia became more industrialized, it was easier for someone who had some artisanal experience to become part of the working class. Let me be more specific. If you had never operated a sewing machine in your life, it would have been challenging to walk into a factory where they're making clothes and simply start operating a sewing machine, let alone needle and thread and start sewing seams or something like that. But if you had experience as a tailor or a seamstress, you probably had already operated a sewing machine, albeit in a very different context, and you already had the training to take on an industrial job. So the fact that there were Jewish artisans of various sorts, table makers, another good example. You were a table maker, tishmacher. Before and earlier on, you could get a job in a table making factory. So you have the emergence of this Jewish working class in Russia as early as the 1860s and the 1870s. And this would eventually form part of the core of the Russian working class movement. You have Russian Jewish work, you have Jewish workers in Russia, and you'd have non-Jewish workers in Russia. But not surprisingly perhaps, in Russia, this is going to be something that's going to translate, it's going to travel across the Atlantic. There were two reasons why Jewish workers in Russia tended to be separate from non-Jewish workers in Russia. At first as a kind of coherent unit, but also in terms of organization in these larger movements like socialism and communism. The first was language. Most Russian Jewish workers spoke a different language from non-Jewish workers. There are many different languages in the Russian Empire. Yiddish was the language spoken by Jewish workers, and they were the only ones who did. So there was a language barrier between Jewish workers and non-Jewish workers. The other reason was probably the more decisive. Most Jews who were part of the working class were part of what economists called light industry as opposed to heavy industry. If I remember my economics correctly, when we say heavy industry, we're talking typically about coal, about steel, about chemicals. Those are the main parts of heavy industry. Typically, workers in heavy industry, this tends to be less skilled. It tends to require little or no education, or little or no know-how at all. It's just strength and endurance. Jews tended towards light industry, especially the dry goods industry, the garment trade, the clothing industry, or they would work in a needle factory or something like that. Light industry as opposed to heavy industry. One of the reasons goes back to what I said. Tailor and seamstress were very common occupations for Jews in the pre-industrial age, and that translated pretty easily to working in a clothing factory as opposed to a steel factory. So the Jewish working class, or the Jewish part of the Russian working class, tended to be light industry. Light industry tended to be semi-skilled as opposed to unskilled. And so Jews really were a separate component within the Russian working class. And when Jews came to America, when Russian Jews began coming to America, they arrived beginning in the 1880s during the age of industrialization, and this pattern continued. Jews in the United States who were part of the working class here at the beginning of the 20th century tended to be overwhelmingly in light industry, and above all in the clothing industry, dry goods. There weren't that many Jews who were in the steel industry or the coal industry or the chemical industry. It was simply a different collection of workers. Now, this is one of the reasons why, when it came to organizing workers, Jewish workers were easier to organize than non-Jewish workers. One of the most difficult industries to organize in terms of, let's say, making a union with the coal industry and the steel industry, for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons is that the workers in these factories tended to be illiterate, whereas most Jewish workers, and this is true both in Russia and America, they tended to be literate. They could read. Now, being able to read is not important because, well, for some it meant you could actually read Marx yourself. That was more the exception than the rule. But think of it: if you're an organizer, you're going to a factory, you want to convince the workers to organize into a union and to help themselves. If you're dealing with workers who can read, You can hand out a pamphlet or a flyer or a card, and they can take it home and they can read it. But if you're dealing with workers who are illiterate, beyond you telling them something, that's all they can get. Here, when I say illiterate, I mean not being able to read and write your own name, not knowing the alphabet, any alphabet, illiterate, more difficult to organize. These industries, heavy industries, were also more difficult to organize because they were much more easily replaced by other workers. Coal miners and steel workers in particular knew if they caused any trouble, if they got fired, if they quit, there was a long line of workers just waiting to take their place. Because it didn't require any skill or any experience. It's simply anyone, that's a job anyone can do. And so, Jewish workers in America were easier to organize. Now, the organization of Jewish workers, which really lays the foundation of the labor union movement, really wasn't the first step in this process of organization. There were two things that Jewish immigrants who were part of the working class brought with them or created in America that made it easier to later on organize. The first was something known as the Landsmannschaft. Now, a Landsmannschaft is literally means like a fraternal group. We would call it a kind of a help group. Typically, what a Landsmannschaft was, the Jews who came from a particular part of Europe, whether a particular city, particular region, even if they didn't know each other directly, they were close enough to knowing each other. They were familiar enough with each other that they would organize these self-help organizations. They would pool their meager resources to make sure everyone had a place to live, help each other find jobs, help each other with food. They were these quasi, small c, communist-ish little organizations. Now, they weren't communist per se, but they were a group, sometimes a large group of individuals pooling their resources. By the way, the largest of these Landsmannschaft were the Jews who came from Bialystok. They were the most prominent, the most successful, and it's no coincidence because Bialystok was a city in Europe where Jewish workers were the first to organize politically. But Landsman is simply a Yiddish term which means coming from the same part of the world. Landsmannschaft, it takes something and turns it into an organization or a group. Landsmannschaft means a group of people from the same area. So they're all Landsmen with each other. That's why they joined these Landsmannschafts. So first, Jewish immigrants had the experience or the benefit of the Landsmannschaft. It turns out that among other immigrants, non-Jewish immigrants to America, while this phenomenon was not unheard of, it was much rarer. It wasn't as frequent. This was a frequent occurrence for Jewish immigrants. The second element which helped organize Jewish workers was a kind of grassroots coherence. On a very grassroots level, you had most Jewish immigrants who came with this wave were living in industrial cities, in close proximity, and above all in New York City. Lower East Side of Manhattan, by the turn of the 20th century, there were 600,000 Jews living there. I don't know if you've ever been to the Lower East Side. It's not a very big area. That's a lot of people, let alone a lot of Jews in one area. Now, I saw an estimate once where these 600,000 Jews there were about 1,000 synagogues there. 1,000 synagogues on the Lower East Side. It sounds like a lot until you realize that most of them were really just storefront synagogues. But the point is, that's a lot of Jews living in close proximity. And it wasn't just the Lower East Side as a whole, but the neighborhoods within the Lower East Side, the street, your neighbors would help you. So there were grassroots movements of all kinds, not necessarily having anything to do with workers or working conditions. Before there was any kind of labor organization, one of the most prominent examples was in one neighborhood, the women in the neighborhood decided that the price of kosher meat was too high, so they staged a boycott, which started on 2 streets and then spread to another street. It was a grassroots organization where they forced the butchers to lower the price of meat. That is a textbook example of grassroots organization. Now, between the Landsmannschaft and these grassroots movements like that, political agitators, socialist and communist agitators, they saw an opportunity there. They said, look, within this large Jewish immigrant community, there are many Jews who are workers, and many of these Jewish workers are recognizing the very difficult conditions of Jewish workers, of the sweatshops. They've also done this sort of informal organization. You want to explain what, for example, a labor union is, if you're talking to someone who belongs to a Landsmannschaft, or if you're talking to someone who's been part of a grassroots movement for change, it makes it easier to explain. A union is something like the meat strike you did. You got together, you created a sense of solidarity, and you got the butchers to lower the price of meat. What we're saying is, if everyone works in the same factory, does that, we can get the factory owner to pay you more money and give you better working conditions. So there was a kind of semi-experience. And so working class Jewish neighborhoods became early focal points for labor organization. Now, in some cases, there were some more radical organizers who thought, oh, these Jews are just primed to become communists. They're going to become communists. I'll give you an example. Look at text number 2. This is an article from a newspaper called The Forum. Okay, now, 1920 was immediately after the Russian Revolution. This is the point where there is this successful communist revolution in Russia, which is in the process of transforming Russia to the Soviet Union. This is the point in the United States when communists believe the United States might be one of the next countries. Remember that Marx, when he predicted, or when he anticipated communist revolutions, he said countries that are the most economically advanced are the most primed for communist revolution. He thought the first communist revolution would be in Germany, the United States. He didn't really expect Russia to do that. That's why Russia got all messed up. China got all messed up because you're supposed to be capitalists before you become communists. But that's another story. So look at text number 2. This is an article written in 1920. Bolshevism has looted Russia, not only of its material strength, but of its moral force. A small clique of outcasts from the east side of New York has attempted this because a disreputable alien, Leon Bronstein, the man who now calls himself Trotsky, can inaugurate a reign of terror because this lowest of all types known to New York can sleep in the Tsar's bed. Should Americans be swayed by such doctrines, such a question, it would seem, should receive but one answer from America. This was the fear, not only that communism was going to come to the United States, but that the most susceptible to becoming communists were going to be Jewish immigrants. They were the ones most likely, because that revolution was undertaken by Trotsky, who was a Jew. And so what if all working class Jews or Jewish intelligentsia, what if they all have that same disposition? That fear, or that assumption that this large community of working class Jews would become communist, would embrace Marxist communist doctrine, was a matter of great concern. It actually be one of the reasons, to be part of the motivation for halting Jewish immigration in the early 1920s. One of the reasons was the fear of bringing communism to the United States. But this in fact was not the case. It's not what was happening among the Jewish working class. Jewish working class was tending in a less radical direction, was tending towards a more moderate version of socialism, known as Bernsteinism, as I mentioned. And Bernsteinism tended in the direction of not the upheaval of the Soviet Union, but the creation of labor unions. That strategy was the one that won out. And it's the one that won out because you have Jewish workers who need to improve their conditions. We're working in terrible conditions, but you have the same Jewish workers who are leery about being part of something which is going to become violent. So they were looking for a way to relieve themselves of the difficulty without creating violence, and trade unionism was the way to do that. That was helped by the fact that trade unionism was also something embraced from a different direction by progressives. Remember, one of the things we noted about progressives, something that, for example, Brandeis believed, is that it's not enough to say that everyone has the same rights. You have to give everyone the same opportunity, and there was a kind of inequality of opportunity between lower class, working class people on the one hand and middle class people. And advocating on behalf of the working class was a way to narrow that gap. Socialist organizers would embrace a similar aim. Now, in their mind, it required a greater transformation of the system. So the end was the aim of creating a labor union for socialists was a way to redistribute wealth in a way that was more just. Look at text number 3. This is an article that was written in a Yiddish communist newspaper called Proletariat, the Proletariat. Okay. Now it's interesting. These are Jewish organizers, agitators, who are really beginning to see the difference between the communism of the Soviet Union, that more radical version, and what might be in the best interests of Jewish workers in America. The bosses of the international meaning the International Communist Movement, which in 1920 was being directed from the Soviet Union, decided that the shop delegate system is undemocratic and unconstitutional. Now, the shop delegate system meant that within each shop, the factory owner would designate someone who would basically choose the shop steward, as opposed to the workers themselves choosing who they want to represent, choosing their shop steward. In the name of democracy, so-called, workers were packed off to a battlefield to fall in a capitalist war. Now, he's referring to World War I here. This was one of the moments of crisis for working class movements all over the place. At the beginning of the First World War, the assumption by every European country and later in America is that working class people would boycott this war because if you have a sense that workers around the world share something in common, which was a core value of communism, it's also a core element of socialism, and to participate in a war is to shoot at other workers. So the expectation was that all the workers were going to boycott. But as soon as the war started, working class people from every country joined in the war. So World War I, in a way, was seen as this kind of fiasco. That's what it. In the name of democracy, workers were packed off to the battlefield to fall in a capitalist war. In the name of democracy, Gompers, in reference to Samuel Gompers, who was an early socialist organizer, a union organizer, Gompers and his clique declared war against Soviet Russia, which makes sense to our ears. The vantage point of this newspaper, America fighting the Soviet Union, or a member of the working class, a worker in America fighting a war against the Soviet Union means fighting a fellow member of the working class. In the name of democracy, the best fighters for the American workers were murdered and caged in prison. We must adopt the shop delegate system, meaning a different shop delegate system in the name of proletarian democracy. We must choose our own representatives. We must choose our own fate. And so there was this notion that it wasn't enough simply to organize. A union needed to organize in a way where its solidarity was not simply with itself, but its solidarity was with other unions and part of the working class generally. This was an important element. This is part of the mentality of the trade union movement. Now, an early example of a successful labor union was the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGW. This was a union which formed, it was one of the first to really organize in an active way. It began to organize around 1908 or 1910. By the end of the 19-teens, it was the largest labor union in the world. Now, as the name connotes, International Ladies Garment Workers Union, these were people who made women's clothing in factories. Now, the organization of this union happened slowly, but a critical moment happened in 1908 in a tragic event known as the Triangle Waistcoat Factory. This was a factory where they made these waist shirts, these waist things, which I always have to look up and see exactly what they are. I watched that whole documentary on PBS about this fire, and I'm still not exactly sure what a triangle waist. It's some garment. Let's just say it's some garment. Okay, it would be so much easier if it was the sport coat factory or the polo shirt factory. But this was a large factory on the Lower East Side of New York City, where the owners of the factory were two Jewish capitalists. They refused to spend any additional money for taking precautions for the workers. So in addition to overworking everyone working 16 to 18 hours a day, in addition to there being no age restrictions on who would work, the women who worked in this factory worked in conditions which were highly unsafe. There weren't enough fire exits, and when the fire started, nearly 150 of these women were killed in the fire. This became a kind of galvanizing moment in the organization of labor unions. Now, the elements were already there. The drive, the initiative to create the union was already there. Sometimes it takes a moment like this to galvanize it. This was an important moment in the success of the International Ladies Garment Workers. Now, the membership of this union was overwhelmingly Jewish. Estimates vary from somewhere around 60% to somewhere around 95%. Don't know exactly, but whether it's 60 or 90, that's still overwhelmingly Jewish. And it really took on the image of this labor union. It was the quintessential union. Look at text number 4. The ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, stands now in the foremost ranks of the American labor movement, both materially and spiritually. It is one of the most important unions in the country. It has won for its members such conditions that very few of the real American unions may compare with it spiritually, and not spiritually in a religious sense, but sort of a secular sense. It is in every respect one of the most progressive. It responds to every movement for justice, for light. It is always prepared to help the workers in other trades in their struggles, to help the oppressed and the suffering. The ILGWU is a blessing to its members, a pride to the general labor movement, and a hope for the progress of humanity at large. So by this point, this was published in the Forwards, the Yiddish Daily Forwards, by 1920. And this is the point. By 1920, it wasn't just that this was a labor union. This is a labor union that became the heart and soul of these larger aims and values, which transcended simply improving the condition of workers. It really began to transform American society as a whole, to instill a greater sense of equality, of fairness, of social justice. So it wasn't only looking for higher wages or better working conditions. It was trying to help transform American society in general in a direction of greater social justice. And in many ways, this editorial embodies what the appeal of labor unions and the labor union movement was for working class Jews. Look at text number 1. Now, text number 1, this is an excerpt from a history of the Jews of New York, written by Moses Richland, one of the first comprehensive histories of the Jews of New York. And here's where he describes why this brand of socialism had such appeal. The appeal of socialism lay in its universalism, in the moral majesty of its social critique, in the messianism of a message that welcomed all men, regardless of race or creed, in the community of mankind. the impressiveness of its learning, the spirit of brotherhood that it communicated, the optimism and ethical appeal that promised an enlightened and blessed time were irresistible. Now, what Richard is really getting at is it wasn't simply that Jews were workers, so they were attracted to these labor unions, to this working class movement. They were also attracted because many Jews who were coming to America, especially in that first and second generation, that they were looking for a chance at a new identity. It wasn't only being part of the working class. They had shed or left behind or rejected much of that traditional Jewish identity of the shtetl. They didn't want to give up being Jewish. They needed a new way to see themselves as Jews apart from an older traditional notion of religion. And the mentality of the working class, the larger moral ideas of socialism, appealed to Jews who were trying to do just that. Now, that's very important to note, that their connection here wasn't only about specific changes, but was embracing a whole new way of seeing the world and seeing the relationship of Jews to mainstream society and the world. And this would be a kind of mentality that reverberated through the Jewish working class. And there were some members of this Jewish working class in Russia who saw an opportunity. One of the varieties of socialism for Jews in Russia was a kind of socialism known as Bundism. It was a movement known as the Bund. The Bund started out as the Jewish branch of the Russian Socialist Party, founded in 1897, just a couple months coincidentally after the Versailles Congress. It began as the Jewish branch of the Russian Socialist Party, but eventually, for a variety of reasons, seceded from the general Russian Socialist Party and became a Jewish Socialist Party, which meant it was a socialist movement with socialist aims. It also wanted to instill a distinct sense of Jewishness in a secular setting, so that secular Yiddish culture found its greatest audience among Buddhists. Now, the Bund started in Russia. It attempted to create a branch in the United States, or to have an extension in New York City, but it met with limited success. Some of the ideas of the Bund appealed to Jewish workers in America, and there were some. I'm not saying there were no Bundists in America. This is when we get to the Q&A, someone is going to tell me, someone in my family was, yes, there were Bundists here, but it never had the widespread success here that it did, especially in Russia and Poland. And the reason for that was that the labor union movement here was far more successful. At no point in Russia or any other European country prior to the 1920s or the 1930s was there a labor union as successful in its organization and aims as the International Ladies Garment Workers. Bernsteinism, trade unionism in America succeeded to a far greater degree than it ever did anywhere in Europe. And so the Bund, which had more radical aims, was more appealing to Jews there than it was to Jews here. But typically, by the year 1920, there was a large Jewish working class that was overwhelmingly part of this working class movement, not only overwhelmingly affiliated with it, but an integral part of it. It's impossible to tell the story of the working class in America without telling the story, without including Jewish workers and unions that were overwhelmingly Jewish in this struggle. Now, this phenomenon did not last forever, though. The working class movement in America, both in terms of socialism, especially in terms of what there was of communism in America, reached a high point in the mid-1920s and then consistently began to decline by the 1930s. Now, one of the reasons for that is that American Jews, that they began gradually to lose interest or lose some direct connection to these movements, mainly because oftentimes, this is one of the differences between Europe and America. In Europe, if you were part of the working class, then you would be part of the working class, so would your children and your grandchildren. There wasn't that much movement in Europe between classes. It was very Downton Abbey. Either you live upstairs or you live downstairs. There was a tendency among Europeans to accept one station in life. Europeans who were working class would proudly say, we are working class, and there wasn't that much aspiring to move out of the working class. America was a very different situation, not only among American Jews, but especially among American Jews. There was this aspiration that even if you are part of the working class, your children are not going to be part of the working class. For me, it's good enough to work in a factory or a sweatshop. That's fine for me. But my child is going to graduate high school, graduate from college, and do something better. Not only better in terms of earning, better in terms of status. Consequently, from the first generation to the second generation of American Jews, in other words, from the generation of Jews of American Jews who arrived here to the first generation that was born here, and even more so, from the first generation that was born here to the second generation that was born here, third generation, there was this movement from the working class to the middle class. For the simple reason that children of working class Jewish families with remarkable frequency did not stay in the working class. And often it wasn't a self-conscious decision. It wasn't any disdain for the working class. It was simply the direction, the way these children were raised, especially once child labor laws were passed that said you can only employ a child after a certain age and only for so many hours. And when public schooling became mandatory, the children of the working class, they were going to school. And by the 1920s, the children of American Jews were graduating from high school in percentages that far exceeded everyone else, over 80%. Some estimated it over 90%. Everyone was graduating from high school, and then college became more and more prevalent. The city college, or what we call city college, Wayne, that phenomenon in the second and third generation. And once you're in college, you're probably not winding up in the working class. And no one was prouder of that than the parents. So this aspiration to move beyond the working class was something very much part of the American Jewish psyche, including the psyche of American Jewish workers. But this doesn't mean that Jews who became part of the middle class abandoned the values of the working class. Even if these children who grew up and were no longer part of the working class were part of the middle class, they still retained the support and recognized the values of it. And that's one of the great examples of that we see in one of the institutions that working class Jews set up, a network of schools, of afternoon Jewish schools, the most famous of which was the Arbiter Ring Volksschule, Workman's Circle. Now, look at text number 5. Now, this was a school for working class Jews, but also this was a school. This was a school, a network of schools with specific socialist aims. Look at the goals of the school in text number 5: to teach the children to read, write, and speak Yiddish, to acquaint them with the best specimens of Yiddish literature. In other words, they're going to learn English in public school, but we want them to love Yiddish as well. Number 3, to acquaint with them the life of the worker, of the broad Jewish masses in America and other countries, to acquaint them with the history of the Jewish people and episodes in general history of the struggle for freedom, to develop within them the feelings of justice, love for the oppressed, love of freedom, respect for fighters for freedom, to develop within them the feeling for beauty and physical and moral discipline, and develop within them idealism. Now, the Arbiter school system continued to flourish long after the working class movement continued to flourish. Even as Jews moved out of the working class, they continued to support and participate in the schools of the world, in this sort of school. Its values, its moral outlook. Children who grew up in working class homes but were now part of the middle class, and they were looking for some kind of after-school Jewish education, to be honest, to be fair, there weren't that many options. There was, Hebrew school, which was on the whole a disaster in many cases. I'm sure some of you have stories. Although there were successes as well. arbitering, I mean, these schools, even though they were associated with a particular political movement, they still had a kind of appeal. This was also the reason why Jews, even though they were moving out of the working class, they continued to remain connected and dedicated, committed to helping ordinary people. And this explains overwhelming Jewish support for Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Prior to the presidential election of 1932, when FDR was elected, most voting Jews were voting for Republican candidates. That had been the case. There was a minority of Jews who were progressive, but most Jews, they tended to be more centrist, and the most centrist party was the Republican Party. Now, keeping in mind, the Republican Party, this was the party of Teddy Roosevelt, still. He was the icon. He was nothing like the party of today, Republican Party of today. These are different, especially because the Republican presidents of the 1920s, Harding and Coolidge in particular, once they legislated anti-Jewish immigration policy, it began to change. But the first election in which American Jews across the board of economic status and where they lived and their own how religious, the first election they voted overwhelmingly Democratic was for FDR and was for FDR's New Deal. And FDR recognized this. Look what FDR said to one of his advisors in 1934, not long after his election. Dig me out 15 or 20 youthful Abraham Lincolns from Manhattan and the Bronx to choose from. In other words, find me 15 or 20 really good, smart, capable young Jews. They must be liberal from belief and not only by lip service. They must have an inherent contempt for conservative corporate attorneys. They must know what life in a tenement means. They must have no social ambition. Now, that was the one thing where that was sort of the one exception to the sort of list of characteristics. Roosevelt recognized that Jews who had grown up in the working class and had achieved something, these were the perfect people to help him plan and orchestrate and put into effect his New Deal. Look at text number 7. This is made by an anonymous observer. Was quoted in a newspaper in 1934. The quote: "The president made use of Jewish brains, exactly where and how they should be used. He's not using them because they are Jewish, but because they are brains." He recognized that Jews, this generation of Jews, had the perfect combination of economic success, moving out of the working class, but also a deeply instilled sense of social justice, which came from a combination of being part of the labor union movement, but also being influenced by progressives like Brandeis and Horace Callan. They were the perfect ones to figure out how to do this. Look at text number 8. This is a Jewish graduate from City College in 1934. The New Deal was a young man's world. Young people, if they showed any ability, got an opportunity. The climate was exciting. You were part of a society that was on the move. You were involved in something that could be changed. So could the conditions of people. Jews, they weren't the only ones who responded to the difficulties of the Depression and the collapse of corporate capitalist society by embracing FDR's New Deal. But in some ways, their particular background and experience made it easy for Jews to recognize what the New Deal was trying to do, why it was necessary, but also why it was epitomizing social justice and fairness, why it was the best way to get out of these problems. Okay? Look at text number 9. This is from someone from Roosevelt's government. His department solicitor, Charles Wiesanski. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins Jr. liked to work with people he called Yiddish Kop, Jewish minds. She liked to work with young, alert people in an urban Jewish background. Now, this recognition brought them into close contact with, well, Jewish socialist Jewish agitators. There was an emerging interest in a woman who in the previous generation had been an important voice in the Communist Party in America. That was Emma Goldman. And Emma Goldman was a kind of outcast in her own time, but later some of her ideas, her less radical ideas, or more radical ideas respun in a less radical sense, they helped people understand. But even more so was David Dubinsky. David Dubinsky was the president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union for decades, and he worked closely with President Roosevelt on the New Deal. Look at text number 10. Our people. Now, this is a point where in 1936, Roosevelt solicited the support of this labor union in the election. He wanted them to endorse his re-election in 1936. And in response, Dubinsky said this, and here Dubinsky is going to define the line between his own brand of labor union socialism and the New Deal's brand of what we might call progressivism. The New Deal was more in the realm of progressivism. Dubinsky said, our people are all socialists, meaning members of this union. I've taught them for years to vote under the socialist symbol. I could never teach them to vote under the Democratic star. We've been wanting them for years never to vote for Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is the shorthand for a city boss-led government of New York City. Never vote for Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is against the working man. Never vote under the star, meaning the Democratic star. Now I can't teach them to vote under the star all of a sudden. I've got to have them vote under something that's got labor in it. Dubinsky, even though he agreed with many of the parts of the New Deal, and even though many Jewish workers did, he saw a difference. In his mind, to be a socialist, you had to espouse ideology as well. And in this sense, by the 1930s, Dubinsky was out of step, not only with most Jewish workers, but certainly with most American Jews. Most American Jews who were part of the working class movement a generation earlier, or maybe when they were younger, and embraced even many socialist ideas. By the 1930s, they had moderated, and they embraced those ideas which were now being endorsed by Roosevelt's New Deal. But New Deal Democrats, this is where American Jewry was overwhelmingly from the 1930s for several decades henceforth. Now, there's one last point I want to make, and this is a brief one, because we've seen this extended experience, extended Jewish connection or engagement of American Jews and with socialism and communism. And the American Communist Party, even as it dwindled from the 1920s on, most of its members remained Jewish. And so it brings us to a kind of oddity. Something that happened during the 1950s, during the reign or the terror of McCarthyism. Because as you know, one of the more dramatic moments of McCarthyism was the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg on the charge of being communist spies in America. When I say remarkable, it's not remarkable that two Soviet spies were caught, because McCarthy and his henchmen were looking for spies under every rock. They were desperate to find an actual Soviet spy in America. The remarkable part of that story is even after Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted, even after it was clear whether or not the trial was whatever, even after there was a consensus that they were spies, there was no reverberation. There was no retribution against the Jewish community. And what that tells us is, from the 1920s until the 1950s, the working class values, the progressive or socialist values of American Jews had moderated to the point where they were no longer automatically assumed to be a threat to kind of stabilized American society. Moreover, by the 1950s, Roosevelt's New Deal had moved the center, the focal point of American politics, American society, enough to the left, where New Deal programs had become mainstreamed enough by the 1950s that the fear of communism was not enough to turn into any kind of anti-Semitic grassroots movement. I would just suggest that if what happened to the Rosenbergs in the 1950s, if that had happened in the 1920s, if that had happened in the 19-teens, the end of the First World War, there probably would have been a pogrom here, if not worse. In the 1950s, the impact was much less. And this really was captured by a writer at the time, Lucy Davidovich. Look at text number again. Writing about the relationship between anti-Semitism and the Rosenberg case, and this is Commentary Magazine. The primary intention of this hullabaloo is, of course, to demonstrate that anti-communism leads inevitably to anti-Semitism, and that the Truman administration, by resisting the march of world communism, must thereby develop into a fascist regime. It is obvious that the communists, by such propaganda, aim to enlist Jews in defense of communists and their interests, but it is equally obvious, or should be, that the communists are also engaged in an insidious campaign, which, if it succeeded, could only serve to establish guilt by false association. Because a spy or a communist is a Jew, the communists proclaim that all Jews are collectively involved. More, the communists take it upon themselves to make this involvement a reality, and so on. The point here, and the reason I mention this, is by the 1950s, the notion, this equating of Jews and communism, Jews and Bolshevism, Jews and Marxism, Jews and socialism, it was no longer a mainstream stereotype. It had been pushed steadily from the 1920s on to the margins and the periphery of American society. Now, it's true that in the 1950s, the objection to communism and the whole McCarthy endeavor was propelled by a fear of the Cold War, certainly. But by this point, it wasn't able to translate in an effective way or in a significant way into some form of anti-Semitism. There wasn't any. Of course, there was a little, but not as much as there would have been. But this reflects the mainstreaming of certain changes, of certain socialist ideas through the medium of the New Deal, though itself was not socialist, but also the mainstreaming of Jews in their politics. After a generation of being enamored by the politics and the movements of the left, communism and socialism, American Jews did what they'd always done, what they continue to do. They gravitated back toward the center. Jews like to avoid radical positions. Here's another example where Jews ultimately avoided radical positions. Thank you very much. So, some questions. Anybody with a question? Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. The question was, did the Republicans think that the Social Security Act was socialist? Absolutely. Republicans in the 1930s thought every single part of the New Deal, without exception, was socialist. They challenged it. They challenged it on Capitol Hill. They tried to challenge it through the Supreme Court. They said everything was unconstitutional. But yes, Social Security was seen as a form of income redistribution. Everyone's paying into a system, and some people are going to get something. It was seen as the government intervening into the income, the economic life of the individual, which Republicans absolutely opposed. Well, Roosevelt had two things going for him. First of all, apart from his own charisma, he had enough support in Congress to pull it off. He was winning these elections by margins that were large enough to give him a mandate. He also had the Depression animating all of this. It was easy for Roosevelt to say, we really need this. Oh, you don't believe me? The Depression. You remember, we're in the middle of this economic collapse that the unregulated capitalism and corporatism of the 1920s has caused. It was very easy to say. In other words, a generation earlier, when Brandeis was theorizing about the dangers of unrestrained corporate capitalism, that was one thing. With FDR in the United States, they were living in the aftermath of a collapse caused by a lack of regulation. Yeah.
He put a lot of people to work with that.
Well, his jobs program was also criticized as being social. You're taking taxpayer dollars and you're paying it put people to work. That was seen as socialist. Absolutely. But that's an example where not only was a form of socialism necessary, but actually it got a capitalist economy back on its feet in a rather ironic way. So if there had been an abject rejection of anything even smelling of socialism and the New Deal hadn't happened, it's questionable whether the United States would ever recover.
Socialism built on our highway.
Well, they built a highway. They put people to work in all kinds of ways. Yes, Mark. Oh, yeah. This last quote I didn't get to. Yeah, it's really kind of a separate. You know what? It's something I didn't get to, but I'm going to come back to at the beginning of next week. We put a pin in that because I can't explain that one in less than like 10 minutes. But I'll come back to this. I'll start with this next week. Yeah.
I remember the Rosenberg trial and execution. I was a child and horrified by it. However, I never heard any association except it was communist. Now, at that time in my life, Judaism would have been Moses. Were American Jews convinced? Was it anti-Semitic? I would not have even known the term.
You know, there were some Jews who automatically assumed maybe it's anti-Semitism, but there's no evidence that the fact that Julius and Ethel Mosberg were Jewish, as opposed to being caught as, it might have helped a little. It wasn't the main part of that story. The fact that their name was Rosenberg, as opposed to, I don't know, Rosencrantz, was almost incidental to the story. In retrospect, yes. Okay. A Russian guy.
However, they had a meeting there in Paris.
Right. Before there was the Bolshevik Revolution, there was Kerensky, who formed the provisional government in 1917, which was liberal, not communist. Yes. Good. Thank you. Thank you. David.
Rampant anti-Semitism in light of the world would you say that anti-Semitism was discredited by the Holocaust?
Well, yes, it was in the immediate. It's still in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. Maybe the reason that's tough to, well, there wasn't that much public discussion about the Holocaust yet. Everyone knew it, but the fact is that was seen as very much being apart from the Holocaust, because this was a case where it wasn't imagining that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were communists. They were actual communists. So, but it was really more like the larger spirit of the time. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I didn't enumerate the specific components of the New Deal. Well, there are many. It's really sort of too much to get into in a lecture like this. But the most important parts were Social Security, a massive jobs program, building infrastructure. Basically, one of the things the New Deal embraced was a form of economics, of Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics, people who, well, critics of Keynesian economics say you pay someone to dig a hole and then you pay someone to fill in the hole, put the dirt back in. The goal was simply to put people back to work. But the New Deal only wasn't about economics. This is one of the things that socialists like Dubinsky and others embraced about it. It wasn't just putting people back to work. It was giving people dignity. You know, someone who, an out-of-work person who was given any job, a job to do, as opposed to sitting and doing nothing, it's going to raise the morale and the energy of the country. So, yes. So the jobs program was a big part. And there was the Tennessee Valley Authority. But really, it was that and Social Security were the main parts. Well, yeah, someone is, because it wasn't only being out of work, it was also the hopelessness that went, that there was no new job in the foreseeable future. There was the notion that, you know, the opponents of the New Deal says this happens, we have recessions, and then we recover. This one was so deep, it was hard to imagine how the recovery would take place. We had a similar kind of concern in 2008, where it seemed like the country could dip from recession into depression, and if the banks and the large industries all were allowed to collapse, it was hard to imagine how there would be any kind of recovery. It was a similar kind of concern. And that was really the motivation behind the New Deal. Yes, Kathy.
I have a hard time thinking of the seen as communists versus socialists. First of all, they're not proletariat. They were farmers. They weren't working in big.
Remember,
factories.
farmers are part of Marxist proletariat. They're the rural proletariat or the agrarian proletariat. They're not when originally he talked about factory workers, but farmers, especially if you're a farmer working for someone else, you're part of the working class.
Were they pumped into the international?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Ben Gurion, until the 1950s, when Stalin turned out to be Stalin, yes, they were closely connected to it. It was a big moment of crisis for communists around the world when suddenly they realized they had been following Stalin for 40 years. It was disappointing. But in that sense, now you're right. Kibbutz were not communist states, but it was a communitarian form of organization, and it embodied the best of what Marx has envisioned and avoided the worst of what Marx envisioned. No dictatorship of the proletariat on a kibbutz.
I have another question.
Yes.
Were there any Jews in that IWW? I mean, probably not, maybe, but.
So, yes, of course, in the more radical working class movements, of course, there were Jews. There were some Jews, but typically, most working class Jews were involved in the labor union. The IWW was too much gravitating toward violent needs to the end, and that discouraged most Jews, even most working class Jews, from being involved. That's just part of the larger pattern. That was true in Europe as well. The more violent socialist and communist movements and parties tended to be only minimally joined by Jews. Yeah.
I'm from Flint, and I belong to a conservative synagogue, and I remember standing and saying a special prayer to save the Rosenbergs. There wasn't any question that the Rosenbergs were Jewish or not, and the prayer was hoping that they would not be executed on the day it was coming
Well,
up.
of course, there was solidarity between American Jews and the Rosenbergs. That's for everyone knew they were Jewish. No one was pretending they weren't. But there was also certainly in the aftermath, in retrospect, when we look back, it's not a story of two Jews being singled out. It's two communists being singled out. If the Rosenbergs had been Christian, they still would have been brought to trial. It would have been exactly the same course of events. Exactly the same course. Yes, one last question.
Were Jews actively involved in Detroit, like General Motors, and sit down and fight in the war with them?
Jews, by and large, did not work for the auto companies. Henry Ford kept them out, and then that lasted for several generations. There was a sort of a Jewish reluctance to work for Henry Ford or his descendants. Not that many. It turns out GM had some fishy involvement with Hitler during the 1930s. In general, the auto companies being auto workers was not something that many Jews did. They were excluded at first, and that pushed Jews in other directions. And so, and typical auto workers, oftentimes by the 30s or 40s, were often the children of auto workers. Jews in the sense that they sort of never got in on the ground floor, and they never bothered to really go very much. I think next time we'll conclude our series by talking about diaspora Jews.